I've been a night watchman at an old hospital for the last 6 months, and I can tell you with certainty that something still lives here. My name is Sam, and this job at St. Jude's Memorial was supposed to be a lifeline. I've been laid off in the auto plant over in the next county, and the bills were piling up with a kind of relentless, quiet fury. My savings were gone, my unemployment was about to run out, and the gnawing anxiety of what came next was keeping me up at night anyway. So, when I saw the ad for a night watchman, no experience necessary, just be reliable and have a pulse, it felt like a reprieve. A quiet place to sit, read a few books, and collect a steady paycheck while I figured out how to put my life back together. The building itself was a local legend, a sprawling brick relic on the edge of town where the woods were already starting to reclaim the crumbling asphalt of the parking lot. St. Jude's was decommissioned back in the early 90s after the new regional medical center was built, and it had sat empty ever since, a monument to a bygone era of medicine and a magnet for ghost stories. The company I worked for, Trident Security, had a minimalist approach to their contract. They just needed a warm body on site to stop kids from breaking in to drink and vandalize the place, or to deter copper thieves looking to strip the walls. It was on paper the easiest job in the world. On my first day, my supervisor, a weary, pot-bellied man named Dave, met me at the padlocked front gate. He had the tired eyes of a man who'd seen too many 3 a.m. false alarms. He walked me through the grounds, pointing out the perimeter fence and the check-in points I'd have to hit on my patrols. He handed me a fat, heavy ring of keys that jangled with a kind of profound, metallic sadness. "These open everything," he said, his voice flat. "Not that you'll ever need most of them." The moment we stepped inside, the air changed. It was thick with the ghost of antiseptic and decay, a smell that clung to the back of your throat and coated your tongue. Dust motes, thick as insects, danced in the beams of our flashlights, illuminating peeling paint, brown water stains on the ceiling tiles, and the dark, silent doorways that lined the endless corridors like open mouths. The silence was a physical presence, pressing in on you, broken only by the crunch of plaster dust under our boots. Dave was a man of few words, but before he left me to my first shift, he stopped at the door of the ground floor security office, his hand on the grimy handle. He turned back, his shoulders slumped, his expression uncharacteristically serious. It was the first time I'd seen him look anything other than bored. "Look, Sam," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "This place plays tricks on you. It's an old building. You're going to hear drafts, pipes banging, rats in the walls. Your mind will fill in the blanks. You'll get used to it." He paused, chewing on his lower lip for a moment, as if debating whether to say more. "Just one piece of local advice, something the old-timers say about this place. My old man used to be a janitor here, swore by it." He looked me dead in the eye, and a little shiver I couldn't explain traced its way down my spine. "Whatever you do, don't answer if you hear someone calling for a nurse." I must have had a look of complete confusion on my face because he just gave a weak, dismissive shrug, the moment of seriousness passing. "Yeah, I know, sound dumb. Local superstition. But just don't. There are no nurses here anymore. Hasn't been for 30 years. And with that, he was gone, the heavy steel door sighing shut behind him, the sound echoing down the long, dark hall. I was alone, swallowed by the immense, silent belly of St. Jude's. The first few weeks were exactly as I'd hoped. Quiet. Mind-numbingly, beautifully quiet. My routine was simple. I'd arrive around 10 p.m., relieve the evening guy, a college kid named Mike who was always itching to get to a party, and then I'd lock myself in the security office. It was my little island in an ocean of darkness. It had a desk, a swiveling chair that screamed in protest with every movement, and a bank of 16 CCTV monitors. Only 4 of them actually worked, showing grainy, static-flecked images of the main entrance, the west parking lot, the loading dock, and a long, empty corridor on the 3rd floor that was perpetually cloaked in shadow. For the first few hours of my shift, I'd do a full patrol. It was the part of the job I both dreaded and needed. It was a way of confronting the building, of taming it. My route took me through the whole place, a 2-hour journey through a museum of silent suffering. I'd walk the emergency room, where gurneys stood in silent formation, their cracked vinyl pads coated in a fine layer of gray dust. I'd pass the maternity ward, where cheerful, faded bunnies and ducks frolicked on the wallpaper, a stark and cruel contrast to the oppressive silence and the feeling of loss that permeated the wing. The surgical suites on the second floor were the worst, with their big, alien-looking overhead lamps and the faint, metallic tang that still hung in the air, a smell I desperately convinced myself was just rust and old wiring. Each floor had its own distinct personality, its own brand of oppressive quiet. The administrative wing felt bureaucratic and sad, with mountains of patient files yellowing in their manila folders, their secrets slowly turning to dust. The pediatric ward on the fourth floor, with its small, empty cribs and cartoon murals, was a place I tried to move through as quickly as possible. The silence there felt heavier, more profound, weighted with a sorrow that was almost too much to bear. This was a building that had seen the beginning and the end of thousands of lives, and you could feel the weight of all those stories, all that pain and joy, pressed into the very walls. The only sounds were the ones I made, the squeak of my issued boots on the linoleum, the jangle of the keys on my belt, the click and hum of my flashlight cutting a lonely path through the gloom. Sometimes the building would groan around me, the sound of an old structure settling, or a pipe would clang deep in the walls as the temperature changed overnight. On those occasions, I'd repeat Dave's words to myself like a prayer. Old building, drafts, weird noises. It was easy to believe. It was necessary to believe. After the long, 2-hour walk, I'd retreat to my office, brew a cup of bitter, instant coffee in my thermos, and lose myself in a paperback novel. The hours would drift by, marked only by the crackle of the talk radio station I'd brought from home and the occasional, cursory check of the 4 working monitors. Nothing ever happened. The grainy images never changed, except for the times a moth would flutter erratically in front of the parking lot camera, drawn to its infrared light. It was boring, and I was deeply, profoundly grateful for it. But St. Jude's wasn't going to stay quiet forever. It was just biding its time, letting me get comfortable, letting me lower my guard before it decided to remind me that I wasn't really alone. It was a lesson I was about to learn the hard way. The building had its own routine, its own life, and I was just a temporary, unwelcome guest. The first incident happened about a month into the job. It was a Tuesday night, unseasonably cold for early autumn, and a restless wind was whistling around the corners of the hospital, making the old window frames rattle and moan like souls in torment. I just finished my first patrol, the building offering up its usual symphony of creaks and groans, and I had settled into the squeaky office chair, a thick paperback open on the desk in front of me. The 4 monitors showed their usual scenes of silent, black and white nothingness. The parking lot was empty, the loading dock was still, the main entrance was dark, and the third-floor corridor was a study in static and shadow. Everything was normal. And then I heard it. It was faint, so faint that at first I was sure it was just the wind or a trick of the building's ancient acoustics. It was a soft metallic chime, a single, clear ding. The sound was thin and distant, but it was unmistakable. My blood went cold. It was a call bell, the kind that used to be in every patient's room, a sound that hadn't been genuinely made in this building for decades. I froze, my body rigid, my eyes lifting from the page of my book and fixing on the doorway of the office, as if I could see the sound through the dark hallway beyond. I held my breath, straining my ears, listening. Silence. The wind howled outside, a lonely, mournful sound that seemed to claw at the walls. I let out the breath I was holding in a shaky sigh. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. A wire shorting out somewhere in the ancient, decaying electrical system. A piece of metal contracting in the sudden cold. Anything. I took a sip of my coffee, but the warmth did little to calm the sudden, icy chill that had prickled my skin. I tried to go back to my book, but the words swam in front of my eyes. My focus was shattered. Every part of my attention was now strained, listening to the oppressive, waiting silence of the hospital. 10 minutes passed. 20. The silence stretched, becoming a taut, humming thing. I started to relax, the rational part of my brain slowly reasserting control. It was just an old building. That's all it was. I was letting my imagination get the better of me, fueled by Dave's stupid story and the inherent creepiness of my surroundings. I was just about to finally sink back into my reading to force the normalcy back when it happened again. Ding! This time it was clearer, a little louder, as if it were coming from somewhere closer. It was a single, perfect, deliberate sound. It wasn't a random electrical fault. It wasn't the wind. My heart started to hammer against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. I stood up so quickly the legs of the chair scraped harshly against the linoleum floor, a sound that felt like a gunshot in the quiet room. The chime had come from upstairs, maybe the second or third floor. I grabbed my heavy 4-cell mag light from the desk, its familiar, solid weight a small and inadequate comfort in my trembling hand. I had to check it out. That was the job. If someone had gotten inside, I had to find them and escort them out. That was the logical explanation, the one I clung to with a desperate grip as I stepped out of the relative safety of my office. A couple of kids, probably looking for a thrill. The main hallway was a cavern of blackness, and my flashlight beam seemed small and pathetic, cutting a nervous, trembling circle in the oppressive dark. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding thin and weak, immediately swallowed by the vast space. Trident security. Is anyone here? The only answer was the faint echo of my own voice, bouncing off the linoleum and plaster walls before dying out. I walked towards the main stairwell, my footsteps unnaturally loud, each one a declaration of my presence. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind against the windows now sounded like a footstep, a whisper, a breath just behind me. I decided to start on the second floor. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my light bouncing wildly ahead of me, creating a dizzying, frantic dance of light and shadow on the peeling walls. The second floor landing was as still and silent as a tomb. The nurse's station sat in the center of the T-junction, a shadowy hulk of wood and laminate. Papers were still scattered across its surface, curled and yellowed, frozen in time from the day the last nurse walked away. I swept my light down the east corridor, then the west. Empty rooms, gaping doorways, the skeletal remains of beds and medical equipment shrouded in dust and cobwebs. Nothing. I moved slowly, methodically, my heart pounding in my ears. I checked each room as I went, a slow, painstaking process. The beam of my light would cut into a room, illuminating a bed frame, a nightstand, the dark square of a window looking out into the black, windy night, and then I'd move on. The silence was absolute. There was no sign of a call bell, nothing to indicate what could have made the sound. I was halfway down the west corridor when a new sound reached me. A soft, rhythmic squeak, squeak, squeak. My blood ran cold. It was coming from further down the hall, from the direction of the old solarium at the far end of the wing. I killed my flashlight, plunging myself into near-total darkness, my back pressed hard against the cold plaster of the wall. My heart was a drum in my ears, so loud I was sure anything in the building could hear it. The squeaking continued, slow and steady, like a rocking chair or an old, unoiled wheel. I forced myself to take a deep, silent breath, and then another. I was security. This was my job. I had to deal with this. I switched the flashlight back on, the sudden beam making me flinch, and started walking toward the sound, trying to keep my steps as quiet as possible on the debris-strewn floor. As I got closer, the sound became clearer. It was definitely a wheel. A single wheel, turning slowly, patiently. I reached the end of the corridor, where it opened into the solarium, a large room with floor-to-ceiling windows that would have once been filled with sunlight and recovering patients reading magazines. Now, it was just a dark, empty space full of ghosts and forgotten memories. My light swept across the room and landed on the source of the sound. In the very center of the solarium, a single solitary wheelchair sat, gently rocking back and forth as if someone had just vacated it. One of its large wheels was slowly, almost imperceptibly, spinning. Squeak, squeak, squeak. I stared at it, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. The room was sealed. I had checked the windows myself. They were bolted shut. There were no drafts in here strong enough to move a heavy, solid wheelchair like that. The floor was perfectly level. It continued to rock, the wheels spinning lazily, as if someone had just given it a gentle push and then vanished into thin air. I scanned the entire room with my light, my beam probing every corner, every shadow. It was empty. There was absolutely nowhere to hide. There were just a few overturned ceramic planters and the wheelchair performing its impossible silent dance. The rocking slowly subsided, the squeaking wheel coming to a halt with one final, faint protest. The solarium fell silent once more. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my flashlight beam pinned on the wheelchair, waiting for it to move again, for some explanation to present itself. It didn't. Finally, I forced my legs to move, my boots crunching on broken glass and dried leaves on the floor. I walked over to the wheelchair, my heart still trying to beat its way out of my chest. I reached out a trembling hand and put it on the armrest. The metal was cold, inert. It was just an old wheelchair. A surge of anger, born of fear, rushed through me. I gave it a hard shove, sending it rolling across the room. It careened into a far corner, bumping against a wall with a dull, unsatisfying thud. The sound was jarring, violent. It felt good. I needed that. I needed to do something normal, something physical, to reassert my own reality onto this place. I told myself it was the wind. It had to be. Maybe a breeze had gotten in through a cracked window pane high up, creating a strange, localized vortex of air just strong enough to move that one wheel. It was a stupid explanation, a desperate one, but it was better than the alternative. I completed my sweep of the rest of the floor and the one above it, finding nothing else out of place. But the feeling of easy, boring routine was shattered. When I finally got back to my office, I didn't pick up my book. I just sat there, staring at the 4 grainy monitors, and listened to the silence, which no longer felt empty at all. It felt like it was watching me. The weeks that followed the incident with the wheelchair were quiet, but the quality of the silence had changed forever. It was no longer a peaceful, empty quiet. It was a watchful, waiting one, thick with unspoken potential. I found myself listening for the slightest noise, my head snapping up from my book at every creak of a pipe or groan of the building settling. The hospital felt different. Or maybe I was different. I was a guest in a place that was becoming increasingly unwelcoming, and the unease was a constant, low-level hum in the back of my mind, a current of dread running just beneath the surface of my thoughts. My second major encounter happened on a damp, foggy night about 3 weeks later. The fog was so thick it was like the world had been wrapped in wet, gray cotton. It pressed against the windows of St. Jude's, obscuring the outside world completely and making the hospital feel even more isolated, like a ship lost in a gray, featureless sea. The moisture in the air seemed to amplify every sound within the building, turning the slow drip of a leaky pipe in a distant bathroom into a relentless, maddening drumbeat, and the scuttling of a mouse in the walls into what sounded like long claws dragging across the floorboards. I was on my patrol in the basement, my least favorite part of the hospital by a wide margin. The air down there was cold and damp, heavy with the smell of mildew, wet concrete, and earth. The basement was a maze of boiler rooms, laundry facilities choked with rusting machines, and cavernous storage areas filled with forgotten furniture shrouded in white cloths like a congregation of ghosts. All of these rooms were connected by a single, long, straight concrete corridor that ran the entire length of the building. The only light came from my flashlight and a few bare safety bulbs and wire cages that cast a sickly, jaundiced glow, creating more shadows than they dispelled. The main feature of the basement corridor, the thing that made my skin crawl every time I had to walk past it, was the old morgue situated at the far end. Its heavy, windowless steel door was always kept shut, a stark, gray period at the end of the long hallway. I had no reason to go in there, and I had absolutely no desire to. The thought of what lay behind that door, the steel tables, the refrigerated lockers, was enough to make me quicken my pace every single time I passed it. On this particular night, however, as I approached the morgue, my flashlight beam cutting a shaky path ahead of me, I noticed something was wrong. The door, which was always closed and locked, was slightly ajar. A gap of about 6 inches broke the perfect, straight line of the corridor, a sliver of profound darkness in the gray concrete. Cold, dead air was spilling out from it, air that felt degrees colder and deader than the rest of the chilly basement. I stopped about 20 feet away, my light fixed on the opening, my breath catching in my chest. My first thought, as always, was intruders. But who in their right mind would break into a derelict hospital only to go straight to the morgue? It didn't make any sense. It was a violation of some unspoken, universal rule. You just don't do that. "This is security," I shouted, my voice sounding tight and strained, robbed of any real authority. "Come on out now with your hands up." The silence that answered was profound, absolute. No shuffling, no whispering, no sudden movements. Just the steady drip, drip, drip of water from a pipe somewhere down the hall. I stood there for a full minute, which felt like an hour, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I knew I had to close that door. It was part of the job. Secure the building. Every door locked, every window shut. I approached it slowly, my boots scuffing on the gritty floor, my flashlight beam aimed into the dark gap like a weapon. All I could see was a sliver of the tiled interior and the gleaming edge of one of the stainless steel autopsy tables. My hand was shaking as I reached out and pushed the heavy door. It swung inward with a low, groaning protest of rusted hinges, opening into the room. A wave of cold air washed over me. I had to go in. I had to make sure it was empty. It was the job. Stepping into the morgue was like stepping into another world. The temperature dropped at least 20 degrees in an instant. It was a bitter, penetrating cold that seemed to sink right into your bones. The air was sterile and foul at the same time, a bizarre and nauseating mix of bleach and something else, something vaguely organic and sickly sweet, like meat that was just starting to turn. My light cut through the darkness, revealing the stark, utilitarian room. 3 steel tables dominated the center of the floor, their surfaces gleaming coldly. Along the far wall was the main event, a bank of refrigerated body lockers, each with a heavy chrome handle, a wall of silent, stainless steel mouths. My light swept across the lockers, and my breath caught in my throat, a sharp, painful gasp. One of them, in the middle of the bank, was pulled open. The long, narrow drawer was slid out about 2 feet, revealing an empty stainless steel tray. It looked like a hollowed-out tongue sticking out of a silent, square mouth, a grotesque and silent invitation. I stared at it, a cold knot of dread tightening in my stomach. No kid, no vandal would do this. This felt different. This felt deliberate, like a statement. I took a hesitant step closer, my light trembling in my hand. The inside of the drawer was clean, gleaming under my light. But as I got nearer, I saw something that made the hair on my arm stand up. On the lip of the tray, there was a dark, wet smudge. It looked like someone had dragged a muddy hand across it as they were getting out. But it wasn't mud. The smell hit me then, the organic, coppery scent I hadn't been able to place before, now amplified and unmistakable. It It was the smell of old, dried blood, somehow rehydrated by the damp basement air. And then I heard it, a faint, wet, dragging sound. It came from the back of the room, from a small anteroom I hadn't noticed before, its doorway a rectangle of absolute, impenetrable black. S-H-H-H-H. 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 It was the sound of something heavy and wet being pulled slowly across a concrete floor. I froze, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by a fear so pure and so total that it was like being encased in ice. My light, shaking violently now, I pointed it towards that dark doorway. The dragging sound stopped. Abruptly, the silence that rushed back in to fill the void was somehow worse, more terrifying. I stood there, pointing my light at the empty doorway, waiting. I don't know what I was expecting to see. I don't know what I was afraid of seeing. After a moment that stretched into a terrifying eternity, I found my legs again. I backed out of the morgue, never taking my eyes or my light off that black doorway. I didn't run. I walked backwards, step by agonizing step, my boots sticking to the damp floor, until I was back in the main corridor. With a final, desperate surge of strength, I pulled the heavy steel door shut. The latch clicked into place with a sound that was deafeningly loud in the silence. I didn't stay to make sure it was secure. I didn't care. I turned and fled down the basement corridor, my boots slapping against the concrete. I didn't stop running until I was back in the relative safety of my office, the door locked, my back pressed against it, gasping for breath, my body trembling. I spent the rest of that long, miserable night huddled in my chair, watching the useless monitors, jumping at every single sound, real or imagined. The image of that open, empty locker and that dark, wet smudge was burned into my mind. Something had been in that morgue, and I was beginning to think that whatever it was, it hadn't left the building. It had just gone back to its room. The hospital was no longer just a creepy old building. It was a place with a presence, a malevolence that was starting to focus its attention on me. The incidents began to happen more frequently after the night in the morgue, each one stranger and more terrifying than the last. The feeling of being watched was constant now, a palpable pressure on my skin, the sensation of unseen eyes following me as I made my rounds through the decaying wards. It was as if my fear was a food source, and it was getting bolder with every meal. The third major event took place in the old pediatric ward on the 4th floor, the one place in the hospital I avoided whenever I could. There was a profound sadness there that was almost suffocating, a place of small ghosts and faded hopes. The walls were covered in a cheerful but peeling mural of cartoon animals, bunnies, squirrels, and bears, all frolicking in a sun-dappled forest. It was meant to be comforting, but in the silence and decay, it was just grotesque. One night, as I was walking past the ward's main entrance on my patrol, I heard a sound that stopped me in my tracks. It was the faint, tinny sound of a music box playing a slow, halting, and deeply melancholic version of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. Each note was a tiny, clear drop of sound in the ocean of silence. Every instinct I had screamed at me to ignore it, to walk away and pretend I hadn't heard it, to just mark the floor as secure on my report and get out of there. But I couldn't. It was my job, and a small, foolish part of me needed to know. Reluctantly, I pushed open the heavy double doors to the ward and stepped inside. The music was coming from a room at the far end of the hall. The notes were plinking out one by one, occasionally stumbling and repeating as if the mechanism was old and worn out, struggling to remember the tune. As I walked slowly toward the sound, my flashlight beam cutting a path through the gloom, the temperature began to drop. It became so cold that a faint, white mist, visible in the beam of my flashlight, began to swirl around my feet, my breath pluming in front of me. I reached the doorway of the room and peered inside. It was a small, private room, containing a single, rusted metal crib against the far wall. In the center of the crib sat an old, dilapidated clown doll, Its yarn hair was a faded, dirty orange, and its painted-on smile was chipped and cracked, giving it a grotesque, leering expression that was the stuff of nightmares. One of its fabric hands was resting on a small, wooden music box. As I watched, paralyzed in the doorway, the doll's cloth hands seemed to twitch, and the music box gave another weak, tinny chime before finally falling silent. I stood there, frozen, my light fixed on the clown. Its glass eyes, one of which was slightly cracked, seemed to stare right back at me, gleaming with a malevolent intelligence in the beam. I was certain, absolutely certain, it hadn't been there on my last patrol. I would have remembered a thing like that. The silence in the room was heavy, expectant, as if it was waiting for me to do something. I took a half step back, my boots scuffing loudly on the linoleum, and the doll's head suddenly lolled to one side with a soft, dry creak of old fabric and stuffing, its painted smile now seeming to aim directly at my heart. That was enough. I fled the pediatric ward, the image of that clown's dead-eyed stare and mocking smile seared into my brain. I didn't go back to the 4th floor for over a week. I just marked it as secure on my report from the safety of the stairwell, my pen shaking as I lied. I knew I should quit. Any sane person would have walked away from that job and never looked back. But I needed the money desperately. And a part of me, a stubborn, foolish part one was starting to hate, felt like leaving would be letting it win. Letting the building and whatever was inside it chase me out. My patrols became a grim necessity, something to be endured. One night, I was walking through the West Wing when I noticed the door to the old hospital pharmacy was ajar. It was a room I rarely checked, a small, dusty space behind the main reception desk. A cold feeling of dread washed over me, but I pushed the door open. Inside, shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, lined with thousands of brown and orange plastic pill bottles, most of them still holding their chalky, useless contents. As I stood in the doorway, I heard a soft rattling. It was the distinct sound of a single pill shaking inside a plastic bottle. SHK, SHK, SHK. It came from a shelf to my left. I swung my flashlight beam over, but the sound stopped. Then it started again from a shelf behind me. SHK, SHK, SHK. I spun around. Silence. The sound moved again, this time to a low shelf in front of me, near the floor. It was toying with me, a predator in the dark. I was being encircled by the sound, a tiny, insignificant noise that was somehow more terrifying than a scream. I swept my light across the floor and saw a trail of small, white pills scattered like breadcrumbs. They led from a smashed bottle on the floor towards a dark corner of the room, behind the main counter, as if something had been dragging the bottle away, a strange and inexplicable act. I backed out slowly, closed the door, and never went in there again. The weather turned as winter began to set in with a vengeance. The forecast on the radio was grim, calling for a massive snowstorm, a potential blizzard that was being hyped as the worst in a decade. Dave called me the afternoon before my shift. "You sure you want to go in tonight, Sam?" he'd asked, his voice crackling over the phone, full of static. "They're saying we could get 2, maybe 3 feet of snow by morning. The roads are going to be a mess. No one's going to be breaking into that old place tonight." "I'll be fine," I told him, my voice betraying a confidence I didn't feel. I had a 4-wheel drive truck. I just packed some extra food and a warmer jacket. I didn't want to admit to him, or to myself, that the thought of being trapped in that place overnight, completely cut off from the outside world, terrified me more than anything I had yet experienced. The snow started falling just as I arrived for my shift. Big, wet, heavy flakes that melted on the windshield. By the time I had unlocked the main gate, driven my truck in, and locked it again behind me, the ground was already covered in a thin, pristine white blanket. Inside, the hospital felt colder than ever. The old heating system was barely functional on a good day, and the storm outside seemed to be sucking what little warmth there was right out through the walls and the rattling window frames. As I began my first patrol, the wind began to howl a low, mournful cry that sounded like a wounded animal, a sound that seemed to be coming from the hospital itself. The snow was coming down harder now, a thick, swirling curtain of white that turned the world outside the windows into a featureless, churning void. Around midnight, as I was sitting in my office, trying to read, but mostly just listening to the storm, the lights flickered, buzzed ominously, and then died, plunging the entire hospital into absolute, suffocating darkness. The backup generator, a relic from the 1970s, was supposed to kick in automatically. It didn't. Nothing happened. I was completely and utterly cut off. No lights. I checked my phone. No signal. The storm had knocked out the local tower. My little island of a security office was gone, and I was adrift in the black, silent ocean of St. Jude's with only my flashlight, a couple of spare batteries, and a growing sense of primal dread. I decided to stay put. There was no point in trying to do a patrol in the pitch black. I needed to conserve my batteries. I sat in the dark, my hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee, and just listened to the storm rage outside. The wind shrieked and battered against the building, and I could hear the heavy, muffled weight of snow piling up on the roof. And then, over the roar of the storm, I heard a new sound. It was a voice. A woman's voice, faint and desperate, seeming to be carried on the wind, yet it was distinctly coming from inside the hospital. "Nurse, please, can anyone hear me? I need a nurse." My blood turned to ice. It was coming from somewhere inside the building, from one of the upper floors. It was exactly what Dave had warned me about on my very first day. "Whatever you do, don't answer if you hear someone calling for a nurse." The words echoed in my head, a frantic, desperate mantra against the rising tide of fear. The voice sounded so real, so full of genuine pain and terror. It was a perfect imitation of a patient in distress. "Nurse, my baby. I can't find my baby. Please, somebody help me." The voice was clearer now, closer. It sounded like it was coming from the third floor, near the old, abandoned maternity ward, a place I had always found particularly unsettling, even in the daylight. I stayed, bolted to my chair, my hands clamped over my ears, trying to block out the sound. But it was no use. The voice seemed to worm its way directly into my skull, bypassing my ears. It was a cry so full of raw anguish that a part of me, the human part, the part that hadn't been eroded by weeks of fear, wanted to run to it, to offer help, to do something. But the other part of me, the part that had seen the impossible movement of the wheelchair, the open Moore drawer, and the leering clown doll, knew better. This was a trap. This was the hospital, the thing inside it, speaking to me in a language it knew I would understand. It was using a voice of suffering to lure me out of my safe space, to draw me out into the dark, waiting halls. The crying continued, punctuated by desperate, pleading calls for a nurse, for help. It went on for what felt like an eternity. I sat there in the dark, trembling, a prisoner in my own office, listening to the ghost of a tragedy that may or may not have happened here decades ago. Then the voice changed. It stopped crying for a nurse. It stopped crying for a baby. It started whispering my name. Sam. It was a long, drawn-out hiss that seemed to slither down the hallway, right to my door, cutting through the roar of the storm. "I know you're in there, Sam. The baby is so cold, Sam. Help us." That was when the real terror, the kind that dissolves your bones and turns your blood to slush, set in. It knew I was here. It knew my name. This wasn't just some residual haunting, a psychic echo of the past replaying itself. This was an intelligence. It was aware, it was malicious, and it was actively, personally hunting me. The handle of my office door began to rattle. Softly at first, a gentle, inquisitive jiggle. Then more violently, the whole door shaking in its frame. Something was outside, trying to get in. I scrambled back, my chair falling over with a loud crash, and I flattened myself against the far wall, aiming my flashlight at the door, my knuckles white. The rattling stopped. Silence. Then a soft, deliberate, scratching sound started, the unbearable noise of fingernails or something like them, being dragged slowly, deliberately down the cold, metal surface of the door. I was trapped. The storm had me pinned inside, and the thing that lived in a hospital was trying to break down my last defense. I didn't know if I would survive until morning. The scratching on the door stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The silence that followed was impossibly worse than the noise. It was a loaded, predatory silence, thick with anticipation. My flashlight beam was fixed on the doorknob, a single, trembling circle of light in an ocean of darkness. My knuckles were white where I gripped the heavy maglite. Every muscle in my body was coiled tight, ready to spring, though to where I had no idea. The storm outside raged on, a chaotic symphony of howling wind and rattling frames. But inside my little office, the world had shrunk to the space between me and that door. I was holding my breath, my ears straining, listening for the slightest sound, the faintest hint of what was on the other side. That's when the smell hit me. It wasn't the familiar 30-year-old hospital scent of antiseptic and dust. This was something new, something utterly vile and fresh. It was the smell of sickness, of old, unwashed linens, and the cloying, sweet stench of rotting flowers and stale water. It was the concentrated smell of a sick room where someone had been left to fester and die, and it was seeping in from under the door, filling the small office with its foul, suffocating perfume. I gagged, pulling the collar of my jacket up over my nose and mouth, but the smell was too pervasive. It was like I was breathing it in through my skin. Then came the sounds, not from the hallway this time, but from everywhere at once, as if the walls themselves had speakers. It started as a low murmur, the sound of distant, overlapping whispers. The whispers grew in volume, coalescing into distinct, terrifyingly clear sounds. A man coughing, a harsh, wet, racking cough that seemed to come from the ceiling directly above me. The steady, rhythmic beep of a heart monitor coming from the wall to my left. The squeak of gurney wheels, rolling slowly, methodically, coming from the wall to my right. It was as if the entire hospital had woken up around me, a ghostly reenactment of its busiest, most painful day. The sounds of its daily life, of its suffering and its dying, were all being replayed at once, a cacophony of spectral noise directed right at me in my tiny, dark room. And through it all, the woman's voice from before began to weep again, not from the hallway, but from right outside the door, a muffled, heartbroken sobbing. "He's gone. My baby's gone. The doctor took him." The words were choked, broken, full of a chilling, genuine despair. My mind was starting to fray at the edges. I was trapped in a sensory assault, a psychological war being waged by the very building I was supposed to be guarding. It was trying to break me, to drive me mad, to make me fling open the door and run out into the halls where it was waiting for me. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing the heels of my palms against them, trying to block it out, trying to focus on the one solid thing in my world, the heavy flashlight in my hand. I had to move. I couldn't just sit here and wait for it to break in or for my mind to snap. My only chance, a long shot at best, was the main breaker room in the sub-basement. If I could get there and somehow get the main power restored, the emergency lights might come on. More importantly, the electronic locks on the exterior doors might energize. If I could get a door open, I could make a run for it, try to get to my truck. I'd take my chances with the blizzard overstaying in here another second. The problem was the sub-basement was on the other side of the hospital, and the most direct route was through the old surgical wing. The surgical wing, the place I avoided even in the daylight, the place that always felt the coldest, the most wrong. It felt like the heart of this place, the heart of all its accumulated pain, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my very core, that it was where the presence was strongest. But it was the only way. Staying here was a death sentence. Moving was a gamble. I took a deep, shuddering breath and chose to gamble. I clicked my flashlight off to conserve the battery and to make myself less of a target. The darkness that flooded back was absolute and total. I felt my way along the wall to the door, my hand shaking so badly I could barely find the knob. I pressed my ear against the cold metal. The sobbing outside had stopped. The cacophony of hospital sounds had faded back into a low, indistinct murmur. It was waiting for my next move. Slowly, quietly, I unlocked the door. I turned the knob with agonizing slowness, praying it wouldn't creak. The latch clicked open with a soft snick. I pulled the door inward just a crack and peered out. The hallway was a river of impenetrable black. I couldn't see a thing, but I could feel it. The presence was out there, a thick, static charge in the air, a feeling of immense pressure that made my ears pop. It was close. Every sound was magnified into a roar. The whisper of my jacket against the plaster, the soft scuff of my boots on the linoleum, the frantic, wet thumping of my own heart in my chest. The air was thick with that sickroom smell. I passed a nurse's station, and a stack of old metal charts suddenly clattered to the floor beside me, the sound exploding in the silence like a gunshot. I froze, my body rigid, a scream building in my throat, but nothing came out of the dark. It was playing with me, a cat toying with a mouse before the final, killing bite. I made it to the stairwell and began my descent, my hand gripping the cold, slick metal railing. The murmur of voices started again, closer this time, seeming to swirl around me in the stairwell itself. I could almost make out words, fragments of dead conversations. Temperature is dropping. Can't find a pulse. Flatline. Call the time of death. I moved faster, taking the stairs two at a time, stumbling in the dark, nearly pitching headfirst down the flight. I reached the basement, and the air grew colder, damper. The smell of decay was stronger here, mingling with the scent of wet earth and mildew. I flicked my flashlight on for just a second to get my bearings, its beam cutting a frantic, brief slash of light across the concrete corridor. I saw my path. Straight ahead, past the laundry, past the storage rooms, past the morgue, to the heavy steel door of the surgical wing's access corridor. I started moving again, this time at a jog, the bouncing beam of my flashlight creating a nauseating dance of shadows. The whispers were following me, keeping pace just behind me. As I ran past the morgue, the heavy steel door, the one I had slammed shut weeks ago, swung open with a deafening metallic groan. I didn't look. I couldn't look. I just ran faster, my lungs burning, a scream trapped in my throat like a bubble of glass. I reached the door to the surgical wing corridor and fumbled with the handle. It was locked. Of course it was locked. My keys. I ripped them from my belt loop, my hands shaking so violently I could barely isolate the right key from a bunch. The whispers were right behind me now, no longer words, just a single low, guttural growl that vibrated through the floor. I could feel a cold breath on the back of my neck, a breath that smelled of formaldehyde and rot. The lock finally turned. I threw the door open, scrambled through, and slammed it shut behind me, fumbling to turn the deadbolt on the other side. I was in. I was in the surgical wing. The air in here was different. It was sterile, frigid, and utterly, completely silent. The growling and whispers from the hallway were gone, cut off by the heavy door as if they had never been. But I knew I hadn't escaped. I had just walked into the center of the web. I stood there in the dark, panting, trying to get my breathing under control. The sub-basement access was at the far end of this wing, through the main operating theater. I had no choice but to cross it. I switched on my flashlight, its beam seeming brighter, sharper in the sterile air. The corridor stretched out before me, lined with the doors to operating rooms. The walls were tiled in a sickly, pale green, the kind of color that was supposed to be calming, but was anything but. I started walking, my footsteps echoing unnaturally in the profound silence. I passed one or two. The doors all had small, wire mesh windows set at eye level. I forced myself not to look through them. I didn't want to see what might be looking back. As I approached, the main theater, I saw that its double doors were swinging slightly, rhythmically back and forth, as if pushed by a gentle, unseen breeze in this sealed, airless corridor. This was it. This was the heart of it all. I had to go through there. Taking a final, ragged breath that felt like it was tearing my lungs, I pushed one of the doors open and stepped inside. The room was huge, circular, with tiered observation seating rising up like ancient ruins into the darkness above. In the exact center of the room, directly under a massive, multi-limbed surgical lamp that looked like a giant metal spider, stood an old, rust-stained operating table. And there was something on the table. It was a shape, a lump covered by a stained, yellowed sheet. It was roughly human-sized, but the proportions were all wrong. It was too long, too thin in the middle, with a bulky, misshapen lump where the head should be. I couldn't take my eyes off it. My flashlight beam was pinned to it, my hand trembling so hard the circle of light shivered and danced on the stained sheet. As I watched, a dark, wet stain began to spread on the fabric, right over where the chest of a person would be. Drip, drip, drip. A thick, dark liquid was leaking from the shape on the table, spattering onto the tiled floor below with a soft, sickening sound. The smell in the room was overwhelming now. The metallic, coppery stench of fresh blood mixed with the chemical sharpness of formaldehyde. I started to back away slowly, my foot slipping on something wet and slick on the floor. I looked down. A dark, sluggish trail led from the main hallway, through the swinging doors, and right up to the operating table. The trail I had been following without even realizing it. A low moan emanated from the shape on the table, a sound of immense pain. The sheet began to move. It rose slowly, deliberately, as if an unseen body was sitting up beneath it. The fabric stretched, pulled taut against a horrifyingly inhuman form. It was all wrong. Too many joints, angles that were sharp and unnatural where there should be curves. The moaning grew louder, a wet, gurgling sound of pure agony and bottomless fury. The sheet fell away. I saw it. I finally saw the thing that lived in St. Jude's. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a spirit or a demon. It was a collection, a grotesque amalgamation of medical waste and human misery given a physical, walking form. Its body was a mismatched assembly of rusted medical equipment, forceps for ribs, bedpans for shoulder blades, all fused together with tangled foretubes and swathes of stained, yellowed bandages in the rough shape of a man. Needles and scalpels jutted from its limbs like broken, compound fractures. Where its head should have been was a cracked glass bedpan, the old kind, and from within its murky, brown-stained depths, a single, dim light pulsed, a sickly yellow-green, in time with the phantom beeping of a heart monitor that only I could hear. I slipped out of the office, pulling the door shut behind me, and flattened myself against the wall. For a moment, I just stood there, letting my eyes try to adjust, but there was no light to adjust to. It was like being at the bottom of the ocean. Using the cold plaster of the wall as a guide, I began to move, one shuffling, terrified step at a time, towards the stairwell that led down to the ground floor and then the basement. It pulled itself to its feet on the operating table, its joints cracking and screeching with the sound of grinding, unoiled metal. It was impossibly tall, its head scraping the big surgical lamp above it, causing sparks to shower down. It turned its head, the bedpan, towards me, and the single light within it flared, illuminating the entire room in a sickening, strobing pulse. The voice that came out of it was not one voice, but hundreds, all speaking at once, a tidal wave of sound. The whispers, the moans, the woman crying for her baby, the doctor calling the time of death, the coughing man, my own name, all layered on top of each other, a static-drenched chorus of pure, concentrated agony. It raised an arm, a thing of steel rods and wrapped gauze, and pointed a finger made from sharpened, rust-flecked scalpel directly at me. And then it moved. It leaped from the table with a sound of crashing metal and shattering glass, landing on the floor with a wet, heavy thud that cracked the tiles. It wasn't fast, but it was relentless, dragging itself towards me, its makeshift body screeching and scraping against the floor. The trail of dark, oily fluid it left behind was thick and black like tar. I finally broke. The scream that had been trapped in my throat tore itself free, a raw, mindless sound of pure terror. I turned and ran, blind panic propelling me. I didn't care about the breaker room anymore. I just had to get out. I burst through the doors on the far side of the operating theater and found myself in another sterile, green-tiled corridor. My wild eyes caught a sign at the end of it, a small metal plate, sub-basement access. Hope, insane and desperate, surged through me. I sprinted down the hallway, the sounds of the creature behind me getting closer, a horrific symphony of dragging metal, wet tearing, and the cacophony of its 100 stolen voices. I threw myself at the stairwell door, not even trying to handle, and it burst open under my weight. I tumbled down the steep concrete steps, my flashlight flying from my hand, and landed in a bruised heap at the bottom. The air here was even colder, the smell of earth and damp concrete overpowering. I scrambled to my feet in the near darkness. The breaker room was right there, a heavy metal cabinet on the wall, its main switch a huge, archaic-looking black lever. Behind me, I heard the thing reach the top of the stairs, the scraping sound echoing in the concrete enclosure. I didn't have time. I grabbed the lever with both hands, my muscles screaming in protest, and threw all of my weight and terror into it. It resisted, groaning with rust and decades of disuse, and then slammed down with a deafening clang that vibrated through my entire body. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a loud hum that seemed to shake the very foundations of the hospital, the lights flickered on. Not all of them, just the emergency safety lights, casting a dim, eerie red glow over everything. But it was enough. I heard a sound from the stairwell, a high-pitched, piercing shriek of what sounded like pain and rage as the red light spilled down the steps. The creature, a thing born of darkness and shadow, recoiled from the light. I didn't wait to see what it would do. I ran. I ran back through the basement, the red emergency lights making the familiar corridors look like a scene from the deepest level of hell. The puddles on the floor looked like pools of blood. I burst through the main basement door and scrambled up the main stairwell back to the ground floor. The main lobby was bathed in the same hellish red glow. The electronic lock on the main entrance doors was buzzing loudly, a sound of sweet, beautiful freedom. I slammed my hand against the push bar. It clicked open. The cold air hit me like a physical blow. The snow was still coming down, a blinding wall of white, but it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I stumbled out into the storm, falling to my knees in the deep, fresh snow, gulping in the freezing, clean air. I didn't look back. I just crawled and scrambled my way towards the faint, snow-covered outline of my truck in a parking lot. My only thought to get away, to put as much distance as possible between me and that building. I left the front door of St. Jude's Memorial wide open, spilling its red, angry light out into the white, silent world. I made it to my truck, my fingers so numb I could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine turned over on the second try, a beautiful, roaring sound of life and escape. I slammed it into gear and fishtailed out of the parking lot, not caring if I stayed on the road, just pointing the nose of the truck towards the town lights. As I pulled away, I risked one last glance in the rearview mirror. For a single, terrifying moment, I saw it, a tall, shambling, impossibly shaped figure silhouetted in the doorway, a grotesque shape standing in the red glow, watching me leave. Then it was gone, swallowed by the swirling snow. I drove for what felt like hours, my adrenaline the only thing keeping me going, my body shaking uncontrollably. The roads were treacherous, nearly invisible, but I didn't care. I finally hit the main highway, and the first sign of civilization I saw was a 24-hour diner, its neon lights a brilliant, life-affirming beacon in the storm. I pulled in, stumbled inside, and collapsed into a booth. I must have been a sight, covered in snow, pale as a ghost, my eyes wide with a terror that no one there could possibly understand. The waitress, a kind-faced woman with tired eyes, took one look at me and just poured me a cup of coffee without a word. I sat there until the sun came up, watching the snow finally taper off, watching the plows begin to clear the roads. I never went back to St. Jude's. I called Dave from the diner's payphone as soon as their lines were working again. I told him I quit. I didn't give him the details. What could I say? I just said the storm had spooked me, the power went out, and I wasn't cut out for the job. He didn't press. I think, in his own weary way, he understood, or at least knew not to ask questions he didn't want the answers to. He just sighed and told me where to mail the keys. It's been 5 years since that night. I moved 2 states away. I have a different job now, a normal 9-to-5 desk job where the scariest thing is a looming deadline. I have a life, but no matter how far I run, I can't escape the memory of that hospital. Some nights, when the wind howls just right against my window, I can still hear the faint, desperate sound of a woman crying for a nurse. I still have nightmares of a thing made of bandages and rusted steel, its single light pulsing in a cracked glass head, its voice a chorus of the dead and the dying. I know it's still there. A place like St. Jude's doesn't just die. It festers. The snowstorm trapped me with it for one night, but that thing is trapped in there forever, pacing the dark halls, a walking, breathing monument to all the suffering that's soaked into its foundations. It's waiting for the next desperate person who needs an easy gig, waiting for someone who won't listen to the old advice. I heard through the grapevine that they hired another security guard a week after I left. Some kid fresh out of high school. I don't know what happened to him. I made a point not to find out. I just hope someone gave him the same warning Dave gave me. I hope, for his sake, he listened. Because some places are too sick to be saved, and the things that live there have been waiting a very long time for someone to talk to. So if you ever find yourself in a place like that, a place soaked in memory and pain, remember my story. And for God's sake, whatever you do, don't answer if you hear someone calling for a nurse. There are no nurses there anymore. There's only the thing that has learned to imitate their patients, and it is so very, very lonely.